Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's story about the old lighthouse keeper and his timeless tale of light and shadows. Let the soft rhythm of your breath guide you as we journey to a quiet, windswept shore. Picture the distant crash of waves and the faint glow of a beacon against the night sky. Find a cozy spot, close your eyes if you would like, and allow the gentle whispers of this tale to carry you toward a peaceful, restful slumber. The Old Lighthouse Keeper's Tale. Part 1, The New Arrival. The small coastal town of Greenport lay hidden from the world like a secret in the curve of the shoreline, sheltered by rocky cliffs and crowned by an old lighthouse that had watched over the waves for more than 100 years. Edwin Harrow, the lighthouse keeper, had been its guardian for decades. Though he was long past retirement age, the townsfolk couldn't imagine anyone else watching over the light, after all, who would keep the place with the same care, patience, and quiet strength as Edwin. The locals knew him well enough to respect his solitude, though they occasionally crossed his path, sometimes in the local pub, where he'd have a single pint of ale and watch the harbor lights in silence. Though he rarely spoke of his past, he'd share stories here and there, mostly for the children who would sometimes visit the lighthouse on field trips. But these weren't the real stories, the ones that lingered in his mind. The ones that haunted him in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. One brisk autumn morning, Edwin was tending to the lighthouse, polishing its brass and checking the oil reserves as he did every few days. With a view of the coastline unfurling beneath him, he noticed someone new. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s, was walking along the shore with a book clutched in her hands, gazing up at the lighthouse with the curious look of someone who hadn't yet grown used to the landscape. He watched her for a moment before returning to his work, dismissing her as another traveler passing through town. But later that day, as Edwin wandered through the narrow cobbled streets, he saw her again, this time behind the counter at the town's small library. Greenport's library wasn't much, but it was a cherished spot in the community, run by Mrs. Thatcher, who had grown frail with age. It seemed she had found someone to help her with the daily duties. Curious, Edwin approached the counter, nodding in a way that was as much a greeting as it was a question. "Oh, you must be Mr. Harrow, the lighthouse keeper," the young woman said, her face lighting up in recognition. "Mrs. Thatcher mentioned you." Edwin nodded, adjusting his cap. "I keep to the lighthouse mostly," he said. "Saw you walking down by the shore this morning." The young woman smiled, a bit shyly. "I've always loved the sea. I'm Sarah, by the way. I just moved here last week." "Newcomer, are you?" Edwin murmured, his gaze sharpening with curiosity. "Yes," she replied. "I've been wanting a change. I needed a quiet place to, well, just to be. So when I saw the ad for a library assistant here, it seemed like fate." She shrugged, looking almost embarrassed by her own words. "Greenport's quiet, all right," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "You'll find it's not like the city. Life here can be a bit slow for some folk." "I think that's exactly what I need," she replied, a softness in her tone. Edwin gave a slight nod of understanding, then turned to leave. Before he did, she called after him. Do you ever give tours of the lighthouse?" He looked back, surprised. Few people asked. But something about her sincere interest, her quiet intensity, made him pause. "Perhaps. come by on Saturday, if you're interested." Her eyes brightened, and she nodded gratefully. Part 2, The Old Stories. Saturday arrived, draped in a thick, cool mist that made the whole world feel like it was wrapped in cotton. Edwin prepared the lighthouse for its first visitor in years, wiping down the glass, tidying his quarters, and setting out a pot of tea. At noon, Sarah appeared, wrapped in a wool coat and scarf, her hands tucked into her pockets. She had a book in her hand, an old, weathered journal. "I thought I might take some notes, if you don't mind," she said with a shy smile. Edwin nodded. "Suit yourself," he replied. "Careful on the stairs." They climbed the winding stone staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The lantern room was bathed in dim light, and as they reached the final step, Sarah gasped at the view. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the vast expanse of the sea stretching into the horizon, a patchwork of gray and blue. "This is incredible," she murmured, pressing her hands against the cool glass. "How did you come to be here?" Edwin leaned against the wall, watching her as he thought back. "I came to Greenport when I was just a boy," he said. "My father was a fisherman, and when he passed, I ended up working odd jobs to survive. The lighthouse keeper back then was getting on in years and took me under his wing." "And you never left?" she asked, turning to look at him. He shook his head. "Never found a reason to." A hint of a smile flickered on his lips. "Lighthouse keepin' isn't just a job, it's a calling. You tend the light through storms and calm, day after day, even when no one's watching. That's what keeps the ships safe." Sarah nodded, clearly enraptured. She jotted down a few words in her journal, then looked up. "But doesn't it get lonely?" For a moment, Edwin was silent, his gaze drifting to the sea. "There was someone once," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "A girl from the mainland, name of Emily. We grew up together, wrote letters after she moved. For a time, I thought we'd marry. What happened?" He shook his head, the memories casting a shadow over his face. "A storm. She was on a ship bound for the village one winter, but it never arrived. Some say the storm took her, others say it was pirates. I stayed up in this very room for days, searching the horizon. But she was gone." Sarah's face softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly hard." Edwin shrugged, his voice rough. "Life goes on, as they say. She's part of the sea now. I suppose that's why I never left. Maybe I thought, one day, I'd see her ship come through the mist." They lapsed into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. After a few moments, Sarah looked up, a curious glint in her eyes. "I've heard that there's a song people hear in Ilara's Grove, just outside the village. Have you ever heard it?" Edwin chuckled, the shadow lifting from his face. "Ah, the Grove. It's just a legend, a tale to keep children from wandering too far. But don't you believe it?" Edwin's smile faded slightly. "I've lived here a long time, seen things others might not understand. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. But there's power in these old places. We shouldn't meddle with things we don't understand." Sarah nodded, her mind whirring with the stories he'd shared. Before she left, she hesitated at the door, then looked back at him. "Would you be willing to share more sometime about the lighthouse, your life here?" A strange feeling washed over Edwin, a mix of nostalgia and a longing he thought he'd buried long ago. He gave a slight nod. "Come by next week, if you like." As she left, the lighthouse felt oddly empty, as though the walls themselves had absorbed her presence. Edwin stood by the window, watching her fade into the mist, realizing with a strange sense of relief that he had told her things he hadn't spoken of in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. And so, over the weeks that followed, Sarah became a regular visitor, and with each story Edwin shared, they grew closer, like two lonely souls finding solace in each other's company. Little did they know that they were about to uncover a mystery far deeper and older than either of them could have imagined, a mystery that would draw them into the heart of the grove, into the lost legends of Greenport, and closer to the painful secrets that lay dormant in Edwin's past. Part 3: The Forgotten Treasure. The days grew colder, the sea choppier, and the wind sharper as autumn deepened, but Sarah's visits to the lighthouse continued. Each visit brought a new tale of Edwin's past, his lost love Emily, and the long, often solitary life he had led. Yet, as close as they grew, Sarah sensed there was still something he held back, a part of his story buried like the rocks along the shore. One rainy afternoon, while working alone at the library, Sarah discovered something that would change everything. She was organizing a box of books from a dusty back shelf when she found an old leather-bound journal, the edges frayed and delicate. Its pages were filled with spidery writing in faded ink. As she skimmed through, her breath caught. The name Emily appeared again and again, alongside notes about Greenport and its lighthouse. With each page, Sarah's heart raced. This was Emily's journal, written before she vanished. The final entries hinted at a secret, a rumor of a hidden treasure somewhere near the lighthouse. Sarah quickly flipped to the last page, only to find it ended abruptly, leaving the mystery unresolved. Had Emily truly been lost to the storm, or had she been searching for something more? The next day, Sarah took the journal to the lighthouse, her hands nearly trembling with excitement. Edwin met her at the door, surprised to see her so flustered. "I found something," she blurted out. "Emily's journal." At the mention of Emily's name, Edwin's face tightened. He looked at the journal in her hands, his eyes darkening as memories surfaced. She handed it to him, and he opened it, his hands surprisingly steady as he traced Emily's handwriting. "I never thought I'd see this again," he murmured. Together, they read through the entries, piecing together the fragments of Emily's last days. She had been drawn to Greenport by more than just Edwin. She had heard whispers of a hidden treasure, an artifact linked to an ancient shipwreck. The last entry suggested she was on the verge of finding it when the storm took her. "She didn't tell me any of this," Edwin said, his voice choked with regret. "If I'd known, maybe I could have saved her." Sarah put a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe this is a way to honor her memory. To finish what she started." Edwin nodded, the sadness in his eyes replaced by a glimmer of purpose. "Then we'll find it. For her." Part 4: The Resolution. With the journal as their guide, Edwin and Sarah began their search. Days passed, each one leading them deeper into the mystery and into Edwin's memories of Emily. They scoured the cliffs, mapped the shoreline, and searched the grove where the ghostly music was said to echo. One misty morning, they found themselves back at the base of the lighthouse, where they had started. Edwin stared up at the towering structure, an odd look of recognition in his eyes. "I remember now," he whispered. "Emily used to say the answer was always closer than we realized." Sarah looked at him, realization dawning on her face. The lighthouse. They climbed to the top, where the light sat in its brass cradle, as constant as the tides. Edwin examined the walls, his fingers searching for anything unusual. And then he felt it, a small, concealed latch embedded in the stone. With a creak, a panel slid open, revealing a small compartment. Inside was a tarnished silver locket, engraved with Emily's initials. Edwin held the locket in his hands, his fingers tracing the delicate lines. He opened it to find a small, faded photograph of Emily, smiling up at him as though frozen in time. Behind the photo was a folded scrap of paper with a simple inscription, "For Edwin, my heart is always with you." Overcome with emotion, Edwin let out a shuddering breath, the weight of years lifting as he clutched the locket to his chest. Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her own eyes misty. "She loved you. She wanted you to know that." They stood in silence, the lighthouse filled with the echoes of Emily's voice, her memory woven into the very stones. Edwin felt a deep peace settle over him, as though she were standing beside him once more. That evening, as they walked back down to the village, Edwin finally told Sarah the whole story of his life with Emily, from their first meeting to their last goodbye. And in return, Sarah shared her own story, the heartbreak that had brought her to Greenport, the need to start fresh, and the solace she had found in their friendship. When it was time for Sarah to leave Greenport, she and Edwin parted with a deep sense of understanding, each knowing they had helped the other find peace. Sarah took Emily's journal with her, intending to write a book about the lighthouse keeper and the woman he loved. And as for Edwin, he stayed on, tending the light with a heart lighter than it had been in years. Though Sarah never returned to Greenport, she sent Edwin a copy of her book when it was published. He read it by the light of the lamp, a smile on his face as he relived their story, knowing that Emily's memory would live on, not just in the lighthouse but in the hearts of everyone who read their tale. As the years passed, Edwin grew older, his hair turning white, his steps slower. But he never left the lighthouse,
If you enjoy these stories,
tending the light
please
faithfully
like,
until his
comment,
final
and
days.
subscribe.
And
For
in the
more
small
lore to
village of
snore.
Greenport, the people say that, on misty nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the sound of an old sailor's footsteps echoing through the lighthouse, keeping watch over the sea, waiting for a ship that will someday, in some distant future, return to him through the mist. The end.